Live from Jerusalem, I'm Lise Doucette. This is BBC News.
And I'm Matthew Emery-Waller here in London. Our main headline, Hamas releases a video appearing to show 3 Israeli hostages.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemns the video as cruel psychological propaganda. We'll bring you on the latest reaction.
Meanwhile, the Israeli army says it hit 600 Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip in 24 hours as it expands its offensive. Hundreds of patients are stuck in hospitals in the north of Gaza. Doctors say it's impossible to evacuate them. About 60 people are arrested in a Russian republic after a large mob shouting anti-Semitic slogans storms an airport looking for people from Tel Aviv. Hello and welcome to BBC News. We'll have more on the escalating Israeli operations in Gaza in just a moment or two. But let's start with that breaking news of the last hour that Hamas has released a video appearing to show 3 Israeli women being held hostage. The BBC is not showing the video, which has been described as distressing. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described the video as cruel psychological propaganda and said his government was doing all it could to bring hostages home. Worth reminding people before we go to Lise Doucette in Jerusalem that the UK, US and many other Western governments have prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organisation. Well, let's go straight to our chief international correspondent, Lise. This is a disturbing development.
Very disturbing, very distressing. As you can imagine, at this hour, so many eyes are on that disturbing video. 3 women in a room. One of the women speaks very powerfully. We now know the names of the women, and although we are not going to broadcast that video, we do have details of what they have said. But let's just first look at the immediate reaction of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He has released a full statement about the hostages shown in the video, and I will read that statement for you. He says, "This is cruel psychological propaganda by Hamas ISIS." Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu has identified Hamas as being the same as Islamic State. He says, "We are hugging the families. We will do everything to return all the kidnapped and missing people home." I turn to Elena Trupanov, Danielle Aloni and Rimon Kirst, who were kidnapped by Hamas, which commits war crimes. I hug you. Our hearts go out to you and the other hostages. He then added, "We are doing everything to bring all the hostages and missing people home." Prime Minister Netanyahu responding immediately to the release by Hamas's military wing of this. It's the second distressing hostage video that has been released by Hamas since they seized more than, the figure now is more than, it's 230. The figure keeps going revised upwards in those massacres committed on October the 7th in southern Israel. And now we have the names confirmed by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, of course, under huge pressure, the agony of the families who are asking whether Israel's intensifying ground operations, phase 2 of the war, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, is now putting the lives of their loved ones at risk. But let's turn to this video. We're joined by our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, who's with us here in Jerusalem. Very distressing, most of all for the families. What did the hostage video have to say?
So only one of the 3 women spoke, Danielle Aloni. She was sitting in the middle. They were all sitting on chairs, dressed in clothes that looked as though they might have been handed to them by their captors, Palestinian clothes, a bit like we saw with previous released hostages, in a white tiled room. We can't say with any certainty where that is, obviously, whether it's above ground or below ground. But Danielle spoke with real passion. She said that they believed that there had been an agreement on a ceasefire that would lead to their release. She said that they had been in captivity for 23 days. That would, I think, put this video as recorded yesterday. She also referred to a press conference given by family members of the hostages the previous evening. That would be the one that we all watched 2 nights ago. So it does seem as though this video was recorded 2 days ago. So she seems to believe that some kind of deal had been done and it would lead to their release. Now, how did she know such a deal was in the offing? We certainly have not heard any such confirmation. Lots of discussion in recent days about the possibility of indeed such a deal in which there might be a ceasefire or a prisoner swap where the hostages could walk free, but nothing had been confirmed. Maybe her captors told her that that's what was going to happen. Anyway, we don't know. She sounded furious that this had not happened, and she also was extremely critical of the government of Israel for failing to protect those communities down on the edge of the Gaza Strip when they were all abducted amid the terrible massacres of October the 7th. And she ended with this really just heart-wrenching plea for the Israeli government to do everything it can to get her and her fellow hostages out now. All 3 women looked pale, as you would expect, probably traumatized by everything that's happened over the last 3 weeks. They did not look unwell, they did not look injured, but that didn't make it any easier to watch.
And Paul, no doubt behind the scenes, every little detail of this video will be scrutinized. As you say, the faces of the women, trauma, the families most of all will look closely. But in response to that video, we've had the statement by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the immediate announcement of 2 press conferences. Prime Minister Netanyahu will realize that everyone will be distressed by that video. He's going to address the nation, and so is that forum of the families of the missing hostages and missing ones.
I think it's actually possible that Mr. Netanyahu is going to be doing a briefing, not a press conference, a distinction that we are all used to in our business, yes, but maybe lost on our viewers, a briefing for the foreign media. Okay. Need to get some confirmation. Yeah. Anyway, he clearly feels the need to speak somehow this evening, and it will be at roughly the same time when we think the families will be speaking. I think one of the things that's worth remembering is who have we seen so far on camera since this whole thing began? Women. Only women. Women who've been released, women who are still being held. Hamas know what they're doing. They are deliberately, obviously, playing on the passions, the fears, the sense of profound anxiety that exists in Israel. And they are acutely aware that the families are demanding that the government do more to get them out, and that there are calls for the government to stop the fighting for a period to get the hostages out. They are playing on that. We cannot say that Danielle was speaking freely, but there was something about the intensity of her words that suggested that, to a certain degree at least, she was. And it's going to just have the most profoundly traumatic effect. Once again, people just reminded of just what this awful 3 weeks has been all about, and the fact that there are hundreds still, more than 200 people, women, men, children, a baby, Holocaust survivors, all of these people still being held somewhere in Gaza. And here we got another glimpse of what that must be like for them.
And despite the agony the families must be going through now, they also, the 3 families, are going to speak tonight. We'll look forward to hearing more from you, Paul, on those developing stories, this agonizing video of 3 of the more than 200 hostages. It comes in the midst of Israel's intensifying ground operations in the Gaza Strip. There were more attacks overnight, with the Israeli Defense Forces saying they had hit more than 600 Hamas targets. But reports on the ground from Gaza today say that there is also a rising civilian casualty toll, with the Hamas-run health ministry saying that more than 8,000 people have been killed in Israeli airstrikes so far, airstrikes in retaliation for the attacks by Hamas on October the 7th in southern Israel. Let's look at all the latest developments with this report from our correspondent, Weary Davis.
After 3 weeks of attacks from the air, Israel says it significantly expanded its military operations on the ground in Gaza, overnight sending more tanks and troops into the Palestinian territory, where they remain. The Israeli army said it had killed dozens of terrorists. Now, new footage showing perhaps how far into Gaza Israeli armour has reached. An Israeli tank firing on a car reportedly near a strategic road junction in central Gaza. A military spokesman wouldn't be drawn on specific details.
We have expanded our activity. This is armor activity, infantry activity, offensive activity that is expanding in the Gaza Strip in order to meet the two goals we received for the war. One, to collapse Hamas, and the other, to bring home the hostages.
If Israel moves armour into central areas, it could cut Gaza in two, isolating Hamas strongholds in the north, but also making it harder for civilians to escape south. That includes more than 50,000 internally displaced people who fled from their shell-damaged homes to the grounds of the Al-Shifa hospital in the heart of Gaza City. Israel has accused Hamas of deliberately basing itself near or even within public buildings like hospitals, and that's why it's targeting areas around the hospital. These people have been previously urged by Israel to leave and head south, but with more than 700 injured patients, that's an impossible demand.
Threats do not frighten the people of Gaza because we are strong people. We were born to drinking salty water, and now there is no water, and we drink salty water. But we are steadfast on this land. We are not moving.
Desperate people take desperate measures, raiding UN stores for flour and other basics. Around 30 trucks carrying basic aid were allowed into Gaza yesterday through the border with Egypt, but nowhere near the hundreds of trucks that are needed each day, say aid agencies. And there are other considerations for Israel. The plight of more than 220 hostages held by Hamas, Israelis and internationals, is impossible for the government to ignore. The voices of the families calling for the government to focus on their return are increasingly loud.
I'm just a granddaughter who's begging to get her grandma back home, and if I will stop believing, if I will stop hoping, then there's no reason to wake up in the morning, and I need to have this hope. So even though I might have different opinion with the government or with the authorities, I have to believe that they are doing their best.
Many of the victims of the brutal Hamas incursion on October the 7th were young people at a music festival in the south. Among them was 22-year-old German national Shani Luke. The abuse she suffered at the hands of Hamas was shocking, and today her mother confirmed that after DNA identification, Shani is dead. Wura Davis, BBC News, Jerusalem.
The agony of the families and loved ones of the hostages, trying, hoping against hope, holding on to that hope that they will soon come home alive. Well, let's just take a closer look at that hostage video released today. We're joined now live by Ambassador Mark Regev. He's a senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Mark Regev, I'm sure you have looked at this distressing video. You've heard the Prime Minister saying this was cruel psychological propaganda. But it does put more pressure, doesn't it, on the Israeli government and army to get the hostages home safe?
So the only good thing we can say about this video is that we have visual proof that these three women are alive, and that is a good thing. We don't know about the other 239. We're watching closely. We hope they all are well, but of course we don't know that for a fact. And as you've reported on the BBC, the numbers of the hostages keep going up. And I'm worried that 239 is not the final number. The number could still rise.
But Israel, as you know, is coming under criticism, most of all from the families who fear that the intensification of the ground operations could put the lives of the hostages at risk. This is something that you're well aware of.
Of course. And obviously the hostage families, your hearts go out to them. You have to feel for them. One has to stand by them. And who knows, I can't even imagine the pain that they have, that they're experiencing day in, day out. I can say the following, though. We don't believe that Hamas is going to release these hostages because suddenly Hamas is becoming, I don't know, Boy Scouts, a humanitarian organization. That's not Hamas. Hamas is a brutal, ruthless, extreme, barbaric terrorist organization. We've seen the sort of violence they're capable of. We've experienced it firsthand. The burning of babies, the murder of those young people at the music festival, the killing of children in front of parents in front of children, the rapes, the beheadings, really terrible violence. So we have no illusions about Hamas. Hamas will only release hostages if they're under pressure. And we believe that by ratcheting up the pressure against Hamas, the military pressure, and making them feel the pain, that is the best way to expedite a hostage release. At the same time, international pressure on their diplomatic allies. You put that together, military pressure in Gaza on the Hamas machine, and at the same time, diplomatic pressure on their allies. We think that is the recipe to expedite the release of hostages.
We know that the negotiations around hostage releases are highly sensitive and you wouldn't want to compromise them in any way. But is it your understanding that they are continuing in places like the Gulf state of Qatar, where some of the Hamas political leaders are based? There's even reports on American media today that at least one Israeli official could have joined those talks. Can you confirm any of this?
I cannot confirm any of that. I apologize for obvious reasons. I can say that the work to get the hostages released is ongoing, and we believe that the military pressure and the diplomatic pressure is the way to get it done.
Can you provide any more details, Mark Regev, on the ambitions, the priorities of the Israeli military now? We have seen today that they intensified their aerial bombardment, but they have also moved today deeper into the Gaza Strip than ever before. Is it your understanding that the ambition is to push in steadily across the Gaza Strip?
Lise, you'll understand I'm not going to go into what are the next moves of the IDF. Who knows who is watching? Maybe even Hamas is watching, and I don't want to give them any advice about how they should better defend themselves. On the contrary, we want to win this, and we want to win this by surprising Hamas. And we have so far been very successful in keeping the pressure on them and for them guessing where our next move will be. And it's best to keep it that way. But our goal remains clear, and I can restate it here for you. We will destroy Hamas's military machine and dismantle the political structure of their rule in Gaza. They are the goals of this operation, together with getting the hostages out.
Concern is again being expressed today by the warnings to the people in the north of the Gaza Strip to leave the area, including people running hospitals. Hospitals are being told to evacuate. They are telling us, and I'm sure they have told Israel, that they simply cannot evacuate with so many children, infants on incubators, very ill people in beds. This is something that Israel is sticking to, that everyone must leave in the north, even if, as the WHO says, it's a death sentence?
So, first of all, we've been encouraging people to leave, to get out of a war zone. It's obviously sensible to get out of a situation, not to be caught up in crossfire between the IDF and the terrorists. And people in their hundreds of thousands have taken that advice and moved south. Now, obviously, not everyone has, and we're aware of that. And in the upcoming battles, we'll be as careful as we can to distinguish between innocent civilians and the Hamas terrorists. We don't target innocent civilians, but I'm worried, Lise, and I say so openly. There were documented cases of Hamas preventing people from leaving. They set up roadblocks, armed roadblocks, to discourage people from leaving. They actually told people in their statements they shouldn't leave, they should stay in the north to become martyrs for Hamas's crazy cause. But I'm worried that in the hospitals, there are people who can leave, who want to leave, but Hamas is preventing them from leaving, and that's because Hamas uses the hospitals, as we've documented, as human shields for its military machine. In the Shifa hospital, we provided evidence, and we know for a fact that Hamas has underneath the hospital They have their military command and control. They have bunkers. They have their command headquarters. Now, the people who run the hospitals, the doctors, they can't say any of that.
And the doctors there have denied that.
Of course they deny it, Lise, because what can they say? Anyone who speaks out against Hamas in Gaza faces violent retribution. It's not a democracy. It's a very brutal regime. We've seen the sort of brutality they're capable of. Of course a doctor can't talk about that. But I'd ask you a question. In all the interviews we've done of Gazans, not we, but the BBC and other networks, since the war broke out, have you seen a single person criticize Hamas's strike against Israel on October 7th? No, they can't speak out against Hamas. They live in an authoritarian, repressive regime. And so the doctors, they might well know that there are Hamas command and control under their hospital. I'm pretty sure they do, but of course they can't say so. They would face violent retribution.
Ambassador Mark Regev, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're coming to the end of the program. But thank you very much for joining us, Ambassador Mark Regev, Senior Advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. Around the world and across the United Kingdom, you're watching BBC News.
Women-run micro-businesses are key to Senegal's development and to improved food security. Access to finance helps them succeed. Since 2014, nearly 180 micro-enterprises, collectives and small businesses across Senegal received concessionary financing. These loans were made possible by an initiative administered by the Q8 Goodwill Fund. The Q8 Fund, Partners in Development.
When the weather can't make up its mind, we can help you make up yours. Check on BBC Weather.
You're live with BBC News and our continuing special coverage of the Israel-Gaza war. Well, as we've been reporting, Israeli forces are continuing their strikes and their advance into northern Gaza, warning, as we've just been saying, all remaining civilians to evacuate to the south, including those in the Al-Quds hospital. My colleague Rushdi Abu Alouf is following all the developments from southern Gaza in Khan Yunis.
Israel has been intensified the airstrikes within Gaza City and the north. Israel has been focusing on this area a lot less airstrikes here in the south, but more increasingly airstrike in Gaza City and the north, where Israel has been operating from the sea, from the ground and from the air. We understand that tanks has been advancing into the edge of Gaza City and cutting the main road, a strategic road that links Gaza from far north to far south. This road is about 43 kilometers, and they cut it from the edge of Gaza City. Tanks were briefly in the area. The communication is very, very difficult here. So getting easy information from the area about where the tanks are and what's going on in the area is very difficult. But I was hearing from an ambulance driver who was taking coming from Khan Yunis into Gaza, but not using that key road. He was using the beach road, which is about 3 kilometers farther west. And he said the road was completely deserted, no movement in and out there, and he was taking this risk journey because the Israelis keep sending messages to the people, about 700,000 people in that area. They asked them to leave south here in Khan Yunis. So he said he decided to take the risk and drive all the way from Gaza City to Khan Yunis using the road. The airstrike also were once again today targeting the area around the Al-Quds hospital, the hospital that Israel has been calling the director of it many times, asking them to leave. He said about 14,000 people are in the hospital, as sheltering in the hospital, as well as 100 patients. 8 of them are connected to the life-saving machine, and he said it's almost impossible to move anybody from in and out of the hospital because Israel destroyed most of the road that lead to the hospital and about 10 buildings around it. So we understand that today about 38 truck or 28 or 38 truck will allow in, but we are hearing that more might be allowed as many as 60. You know, the UN said we need daily at least 100 truck to feed. You know, 2/3 of the population are in this southern part of Gaza city. They are living for about 24 days now or 23 days without water, without electricity and without proper food. So the food shortages are severe. We saw hundreds of people queuing in the bakeries to get bread. The fuel in here in the hospital are severely decreased, and they said any minute they have to shut the operation in the hospital. So what the people are hoping here is for a sustainable humanitarian corridor from Egypt into Gaza that allow aid in, but also allow people who severely injured in the continuous Israeli airstrikes to be out to Egypt for treatment.
Hope in this darkest of times. Stay with us here on BBC News.
Hello, it's time for us to take a look at the weather prospects across Europe. It is looking really quite turbulent this week, I have to say. Low pressure systems firmly in charge. One weather system sliding its way eastwards, bringing some really heavy rain for a time across the Alps, the north of Italy, that migrating eastwards towards the Balkans on Tuesday. The moisture being fed into this weather system by some quite brisk winds moving up through the Adriatic. Down towards the southeast, it is quieter, but the odd shower breaking out across southern Turkey and into Cyprus. Greece looks mainly fine, but the Balkans turns increasingly wet. Drier conditions for a time across those northern portions of Italy. Another weather system moving close to the south of Spain and southern Portugal, affecting Gibraltar too. Various areas of rain or showers for the UK into France. And then another area of wet weather moving through southern Scandinavia, northern Germany, northern Poland. Some snow on the northern edge of that. Some quite significant snow across parts of Scandinavia and into the western side of Russia on Wednesday. Further showers moving across France, down into Italy, and then out to the west. A really deep area of low pressure is expected to develop. This has been named by the UK Met Office Storm Kieran, and it's going to bring huge amounts of rain and some really strong winds across the UK, the Republic of Ireland, France as well. That could cause some quite significant disruption as we move through Wednesday into Thursday.
I was born before 2005, so I don't have the right to know who my donor was. But I'm off to meet a brother and sister who do.
Hello, you okay? Oh, look at your curls, you've got beautiful curls.
Twins Phoebe and Matthew have always known their donor conceived.
We decided, because the change in law was coming up in 2005, that we would wait to start IVF, because for the sake of a few months, we just felt it wasn't fair on any children we might have had to deny them that opportunity to find out who our donor was. But as they got older and started asking questions, they were very keen on, well, how old is he? What's his name? What does he do? So I did a bit of research and we found we could send away for non-identifiable information. And then I think the biggest surprise for us, he was born in Colombia, and it was kind of like, okay, that was a bit of a shock, not quite what we were expecting.
This is the first submarine known to have been used to bring cocaine from South America to Europe. It's homemade, and it travelled 4,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean.
So the group's just arrived in Kiev, but this is just the very first stage of an extremely long and arduous journey to try and get their children back.
Some of the migrants took with them samples of soil of their homeland. I can very much relate to that. I know how it feels to lose your home.
Now, women also have an identity. Earlier, only men were known by their names. Now, women are identified as individuals too.
Inspiring short films from the BBC.
It's time to vote for the BBC Women's Footballer of the Year 2023, and the global shortlist is out. The 5 finalists are Aitana Bonmati, Mary Earps, Sam Kerr, Alexandra Pop, Fridolina Rolfer. Your choice, your champion. Go to bbc.com/women's football before voting closes on the 3rd of November at 9 GMT. Terms and privacy notice are online.
Welcome to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. Hamas has released a video appearing to show 3 Israeli women being held hostage. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described the footage as cruel psychological propaganda and said his government was doing all it could to bring hostages home. The Israeli army says it's expanding its operations in the Gaza Strip with more infantry, artillery and armoured vehicles entering the territory. Israel says it hit 600 military targets in the last 24 hours and killed dozens of Hamas fighters. And the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees says hundreds of patients are stuck in hospitals in northern Gaza. Doctors say Israel told staff to evacuate the Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City on Sunday, but that moving patients, many of whom are in intensive care, is impossible. Well, let's return straight away to that breaking news that Hamas has released a video appearing to show 3 Israeli women being held hostage. The BBC is not showing that video, which has been described as distressing. Well, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reacted to that video in a statement saying this is cruel psychological propaganda by Hamas ISIS. We are hugging the families. We will do everything to return all the kidnapped and missing people home. I turn to Elena Trupanov, Danielle Aloni and Ramon Kirst, who were all kidnapped by Hamas, who commits war crimes. I hug you, the statement says. Our hearts go out to you and the other hostages. He then added, we are doing everything to bring all the hostages and missing people home. Well, let's speak now to Noam Sagi, whose mother was kidnapped on the 7th of October. Noam, thank you so much for joining us here on BBC News. Another terribly, terribly difficult day. Your reaction, first of all, to the release of this Hamas video?
You know, we kind of expecting it for quite some time, that the psychological torture that we find ourselves in for the last 3 weeks will intensify. Every day just get more difficult. And you know, it's something that we expect. It's never easy. It's not something that life does not prepare you for a moment like this. And it is not easy to see that. Of course, it's good. In our life now, it's good news to see that they're alive, but, you know, it is distressing.
And of course, we have no idea about levels of coercion used to actually extract what was said in this video. So certainly everything we've heard from the Israeli government, very, very careful. But you talked about the excruciating moments this is. I was listening to one family member only last week who said they'd simply lost contact of what day of the week it was. All they could know was that it was either day 18, day 19, day 20 since October the 7th. Is it similar for you?
Yes, you know, it is very similar. I think it feels like one long day. You know, it's very hard to get sleep, food, and so much is happening. But nothing is happening. You know, the one thing you want to happen is not happening, or at least we don't know. So if there is something going on, we don't know about it. But the reality is that, you know, we are working around the clock. I'm sitting here with you and I'm going from one place to another and try to put all my weight and influence in so many different ways. So it never been so intense, but reality is that nothing is happening at the same time. And that is quite tricky to the brain to contain.
Tell our viewers a little bit more about your mother and how you think perhaps she will be coping with 3 weeks plus.
You know, we just pray that she is in no harm. I know she was injured when she was taken from her home, and I just hope that is not significant injury. We don't know the details of that. In her nature, she would look after the kids and she would look after the elderly. She will, she is 75, but she would find herself, probably looking after the 80 plus and the kids. She's very positive and strong in her nature. I'm worried because if she is underground, I know that her respiratory system is not the best and she will struggle. But, it's a lot of worries, and I can worry in so many different directions. I rather fantasize than worry because it is just, this is what it's all about.
That's a fascinating phrase you use. You'd prefer to fantasize rather than actually take time to worry for all of those areas that potentially are so negative. You said something incredibly startling when I was listening to you doing a radio interview last week. You said that the scenes at the kibbutz on October the 7th, where there was looting, gave you hope. Just explain a little more what you mean by that.
You look at the videos and you look at the footage that came on that day, and it's all very, very, very distressing and very difficult to watch. But when I see people, ordinary Gazans who come into the kibbutz, into the community, and they take coffee machines and they take kids' bike with them, what they have in mind is that they're going to improve the lifestyle wherever they are. And I think anyone who's doing that is actually thinking about future. They want to better the future. And that gives me hope because it tells me that these people, they are not really the Hamas. They are not the people who created this horrendous atrocity. I think this is ordinary people like me and like my mom who wants a better future, probably with a kid's bike going around. And that gives me a lot of hope because I think between the people, this is where we can see change. This is where future has a chance to be different than what we see right now in front of our eyes.
I was just reading out the statement from Israel's Prime Minister reacting to this video only a short while ago, but Haaretz published an editorial in the last day or so saying the state does not have the mandate to sacrifice 229 plus people. The government must declare that the return of the hostages is their most important goal. Where are you in terms of the tactics you've seen from Israel's government, the launch of this ground incursion? What do you think as you've watched things develop over the last 2 or 3 days?
I'm not a military expert and I'm not a politician. I'm a son who wants his mom back. The reason you talk to me is because someone decided to take my mom out of her home, and then we all engulf in this. And now I ask questions about my views on the Middle East, which I have a lot of. That is something I'm happy to share. I think Israel have very little leverage. So I think it's wrong to try and create leverage on the ground in a military aspect. I think the leverage should come from Qatar. This is where people have the power to come up with a deal. And I think if we will now release 230 people, hostages, back, it will de-escalate and will end this cycle. And hopefully everything will completely relax. So I think we're looking at the wrong end. Israel will react because this is what they will do.
Well, that's a very interesting assessment, because we were listening to Mark Regev only, 15 minutes ago, saying that that action on the ground was designed to ratchet up the pressure. That's how the government saw it, ratchet up the pressure on Hamas in a way to actually get the release of those hostages. But Noam Sagi, thank you so much for talking to us here on BBC News. Thanks so much. Well, let's talk now live to Gershon Baskin, who's familiar with Hamas and its hostage tactics, having helped secure the release of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit from Hamas more than a decade ago. Interesting what we were just hearing from Noam Sagi, saying that actually the focus needed to be on Qatar. I'll come to that in a moment or two, but in terms of this development of a hostage video, give me your assessment of what that does in terms of potentially upping the pressure again on the Israeli Prime Minister.
First of all, I think we have to recognize that the three women we saw are alive. They don't appear to have been tortured. They definitely do look under duress. And there's no doubt that this is aimed of pressuring Israeli society to pressure the Israeli government to make the deal that Hamas is demanding, which is all the hostages for all the prisoners in Israeli prisons, Palestinian prisoners, between 6,000 and 7,000 people, of whom 559 are serving life sentences, some of them multiple life sentences for murdering Israelis. That's what we're talking about here. And that is the extraordinary dilemma that the Israeli decision makers need to deal with now.
And in terms of the negotiations, we know before the ground offensive that those were going on. What is your understanding of where that potentially now is? Is your interpretation that they were not making progress and so the ground invasion started, or potentially those contacts, those negotiations are still going on? Which do you think it is?
I believe that negotiations are still going on, not only in Qatar, but also in Egypt. In fact, I personally have more confidence in the Egyptian track than the Qatari track, but the government of Israel and the United States are seeming to put all the pressure on Qatar. Whoever succeeds, it doesn't really matter who gets the credit and who succeeds. The point is that there is a moral responsibility of the government of Israel to return all the hostages. And the window of opportunity is open as long as the full ground incursion hasn't begun. So I think that there is an intent of Israel putting more pressure on Hamas to make a deal. We have to understand that the deal is not just the exchange. If we're talking about the all for all the hostages for all the prisoners, the question is it being done in one release? Are they all going to be released at the same time, or is Hamas going to try and drag this over a longer period of time? Where are the prisoners going to go? Where are all these Palestinian prisoners going to go? Are they all going to be sent to Gaza? Are some going to be allowed to go back to their homes in the West Bank? Most of them are from the West Bank. Most of them are not members of Hamas, but we have a group of people who are in prison for trying to do things against Israel and Israelis, some of them having done horrific things against Israelis. And there are real security risks involved here that the government of Israel needs to deal with.
So how difficult does it then make it to be even considering releasing, if not the majority of them, all of them?
Well, I think that the public pressure, the public opinion in Israel has shifted sharply from 3 weeks ago, when there was a great agreement across all of Israel that the primary directive was to remove Hamas's ability to govern Gaza and threaten Israel. Dismantling Hamas was the directive of the society, of the government, of the army, and that has changed. And I would wager to say that there's probably a small majority today who say that the first priority is the hostages. The weight of the message of the families of the hostages, the stories that we've told, the pictures of the infants, the children, the women, the elderly, all these hostages being held is weighing heavily on Israeli society. There's no doubt that this latest video will increase public resolve to free the hostages first. There is probably no way of freeing all the hostages without a negotiated agreement. Doing an agreement for part of the hostages, the civilians, the women, the children, the elderly, would still leave tens of hostages in Hamas's hands, probably 50, 60, 70. We don't know the exact number of hostages that Hamas considers to be soldiers, whether they are or not. And that's an impossible reality for Israel to deal with as well.
Kirshon Baskin, thanks for joining us and giving us those reflections. Thanks so much for being here on BBC News. Well, as casualties mount on both sides of the conflict, the international community has called for a humanitarian pause, if not a ceasefire. But both sides continue to accuse each other of atrocities and show no sign of actually backing down. Well, let's talk now to David Sheffer, who's former US Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues. Thank you, David, for being here on the programme. Let's take this in stages, if we could. In terms of what happened on October the 7th, the killings, the hostage taking, and now hostage videos like we've seen being released in the last couple of hours. Where is your analysis in terms of breaches of international law?
Well, what happened on October 7th was unquestionably breaches of international law. international humanitarian law, international criminal law. There was a lot of international law that was violated. And that was, of course, violations by Hamas with respect to its actions against mostly Israeli civilians in the kibbutz area of Israel. That's pretty unquestionable. In terms of the hostages that are now held by Hamas, of course, hostage taking itself is illegal. It's a war crime. Hamas committed that war crime in taking the hostages. What we saw today, particularly this film of the 3 hostages, I do agree with one of the individuals you interviewed just before me that the only good news one takes out of this is proof of life, that in fact there's now proof that these women are at least alive. However, they clearly have been, one can speculate pretty positively that they've been compelled to say what they said. In fact, it was sort of odd, frankly, the drafting of what they had to say, because Hamas, if Hamas was coaxing them or compelling them to say these things, was basically saying, you, Bibi Netanyahu, and the Israeli government failed to protect us and caused us to be held as hostages by Hamas, which is sort of a strange distortion, obviously, of what happened. There's a lot of blame to go around in the Israeli government, but the idea that now the hostages are somehow lecturing through the voice of Hamas that the Israeli government has failed, and therefore by failing to protect them, that would lead to the need to release the hostages in return for all of the Palestinian prisoners in Israel. It's a rather distorted message. It doesn't make much sense.
Let's turn to the Israeli response. 2 questions, but I'll take them one at a time, because we've seen over the last 24, 36 hours their order to leave Al-Quds hospital, similar red flag around the Al-Shifa hospital. What does international law say about targeting places like that when Israel says they think they're being used in part as command and control centers for Hamas?
This is a very important question. And the reason is that on its face, hospitals are not to be struck during wartime. It would be a war crime to actually strike a hospital intentionally on its face. Why? Because the hospital has non-combatants in it, patients. In this case, there are a lot of civilians hiding in the hospital. That we know pretty well. If Hamas has some core group within this hospital, perhaps in the basement or a deeper tunnel under the hospital, yes, that is a problem. But it would not be a problem that would be solved by a massive airstrike on a hospital that would result in a far disproportionate number of civilians being killed. That would violate the principle of proportionality under international law. You would need to get to that Hamas targeted group under the hospital or within the hospital with a different strategy of taking them down that would minimize and distinguish between minimize the casualties of civilians and of patients, and also a far clearer distinction between who's civilian and who's military. Extremely difficult, but an airstrike is not the magical instrument to get at that command post of Hamas if it exists in the hospital. You cannot do that. That's a magical vision of how to handle it that just would not work under international law.
A final question then, and you will have heard the arguments rehearsed over the last weeks around collective punishment, around the blockade, around that order for people to move. Where do all of those sit with international law?
Well, again, very important, because it is certainly legal for in a legitimate combat situation, which the Israeli army is in by crossing and engaging with Hamas, which is the enemy here, in self-defense. It is legitimate to tell the civilian population or to ask them to evacuate temporarily so that they ensure their own safety and are not caught up in the combat scenario that will undoubtedly take place in Gaza City. The problem is if that evacuation request is then turned into a permanent evacuation of that population ultimately needs to have the right to come back into their neighborhoods and reconstruct their lives there, and not have this be a permanent request by the Israeli army of evacuation. And as we know, the Palestinians are very concerned about this. But I think it's paramount to emphasize that the reason for the evacuation order is safety, but also safety in order to get to humanitarian lines of food and water and even electricity. And that's the other equation that Israel has to be very careful to be moving on and working on and cooperating on, particularly at the Rafah gate, so that that humanitarian aid gets to those who have evacuated.
David, I have to leave it there, but thanks so much for those reflections, talking to us here on our programme. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.
Are you a raver?
Do I look like a raver?
I've got bass in a backpack. This is amazing.
Dancing for like 4 or 5 hours of a gig, you could generate about 800 kilowatt hours of thermal energy.
Right, shall we give it a taste then? It's my favourite.
We're really talking to the plants and they're telling us how happy they are.
It can fly, but it can also float on water.
Oh my God, that came by quick. It's all about augmented reality.
Beautiful, right? Beautiful.
Totally and utterly immersed in another world there.
Your Tech Update. Click on BBC News.
Free speech is meaningless unless you allow people you don't like to say things you don't like.
After winning, like the people were so proud and it was so intense.
Сказав моїй дружині, треба збиратись, треба піднімати дітей. Почалась війна.
I never thought I was going to be a famous movie person.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
You're live with BBC News. Now, the Russian government has blamed external forces for the storming of an airport in Dagestan by crowds who shouted anti-Semitic slogans and waved Palestinian flags. These are the pictures from social media. Without providing any evidence, the Foreign Ministry in Moscow accused Ukraine of playing a key role. After rampaging through the terminal building, hundreds charged onto the runway. They were searching for passengers arriving from Israel. Well, let's talk live now and head to Jerusalem and speak to Amichai Chikli, who's Israeli Minister for Diaspora Affairs and combating anti-Semitism. Minister, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us on the programme. Your reaction to those scenes that we saw from that airport in Dagestan?
Extremely disturbing. I think this is extremely bad. What we've seen in Dagestan is a result of incitement, it's a result of the atrocities of Hamas that inspired radical jihadists and radical Islamists all across the globe to go and attack and assault Jews wherever they are. We saw also disturbing pictures coming from campuses within the US. We've seen Jewish students locked in the library with a mob on the doors outside trying to attack them, to assault them. We've seen in UCLA demonstrations with pro-Palestinian students that are singing, "We want a Jewish genocide." That's what they're singing. It's extremely disturbing, and we cannot accept these pictures. And I'm expecting the governments all across the West, and not just the West, also in other countries,
It has
against those people.
It has horrifying echoes, certainly in Russia, historically. In terms of what your fears are now for Israelis abroad, give me your assessment.
So it's more than Israelis. It's more against the Jews. It's not just the Israelis. It's Jews and Israelis. And we've seen the numbers. We've seen an increase of 500% in anti-Semite incidents. We've seen a major increasing in 1,180% in terms of call to attack and assault Jews. And I think that this is extremely disturbing, and we are operating with the governments to try and to minimize these events. For instance, with the French government, they have made it clear that demonstrations of pro-Hamas are illegal, and you can get arrested for 5 years for demonstrating in favor of Hamas atrocities. And we've seen also what happened in the streets of London, which I think is also it's a red light.
Yes, and we've had that Cobra meeting with the Prime Minister. I've only got about 45 seconds left, but the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem warned that Europe is the next step in terms of anti-Semitism attacks. Presumably you have the same fear.
Absolutely. I think it's a fact. You can see the people, you can see what are they singing, what are the words. You can see also the violence that they use when they see a pro-Israeli peaceful demonstration or gathering to commemorate the victims of October 7. And I think it's time for Europe to wake up and to understand that we are together.
Yes.
We are here.
Minister, we are out of time, and certainly British ministers.
We're sharing the same values, and we need to fight together to preserve our values, Minister, human dignity, freedom.
We are out of time. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News. Thank you.